The STEM learning ecosystems and the STEM Push Network are pleased to be tackling important issues concerning racially and ethnically minoritized students in STEM disciplines and higher education. You can find the full conversation and summary on stemlearningecosystems.org.
Today's webinar is the latest in the ongoing community conversations sponsored by TIES and the STEM Learning Ecosystems Community of Practice. Today, we're going to talk about how COVID has held up a microscope to many of our systems, and the college admissions process was not spared in this crisis. Many colleges and universities have already decided to temporarily or outright cancel the use of standardized testing in the decision-making process moving forward. With standardized testing off the table, we have the opportunity to create a more equitable system. We're going to do something a little bit different today. In a conversation with the panelists last week, Eric, who you'll meet in a second, brought up that if we want to start tackling this problem, we need to all start to feel comfortable talking about things that are difficult to talk about. We have to understand where we all come from. And so I'm going to ask each of our panelists to also share how they identify racially themselves and how that's impacted themselves and their work. I'd like to start with Marie Bigham. Marie is the founder and executive director of Accept, Admissions Community, Cultivating Equity and Peace Today, an advocacy group and community that centers racial justice in the college admissions process and profession. Recently named a global game changer by Facebook, Marie is a national leader in college admissions redesign and reform. In 2018, Accept received the Excellence in Education Award from the National Association for College Admissions Counseling, awarded to those who use their prominence to advance equity and access in education. Marie, thanks for joining us today. I'm wondering what the biggest impact that you've seen so far in your work to change the admissions process is.
Sure. So Marie Bigham, and I am here in New Orleans, just to let you all know, where we dodged yet another hurricane, thankfully. But I live here in New Orleans, which is the unceded territorial lands of the Chidi and the Amacha natives here. And so just to acknowledge that that's where I live. And as we talked about earlier, my racial background, my identity is I am Vietnamese and white. Because of my generation of age cohort being very Xer, I tend to identify as other with a big capital O, because that's the box we had to check. That's what we were told for so long. And to your point, where you said we all have to get comfortable talking about things that are uncomfortable, like race, I can be really honest with you. Race is one of the few things I'm super comfortable talking about, because it's something I've been talking about my whole life. And it's the lens through which I've seen the world for as long as I remember. You know, like what's the biggest change for me is the sudden acknowledgement that this process that has seemed so set in stone for so long, suddenly that parts of it were fungible, that there were things that we could toss aside and just walk away. So that kind of willingness, although perhaps less at this stage than perhaps in March, but that willingness to say, ooh, we just don't need that anymore. To me, it's been exciting and curious.
We also are joined by Akil Bello. Akil is an educator, speaker, entrepreneur, and testing expert. Akil has worked at every level of the supplemental education industry, advising universities, launching multiple companies, developing dozens of admissions and test preparation programs, training hundreds of instructors, and helping thousands of students achieve success. Akil was founding partner and CEO for Bell Curves, a test preparation company that focuses on helping public schools, nonprofit organizations, and community-based organizations understand standardized tests and admissions and develop affordable solutions for their students. Currently, Akil serves as Senior Director of Advocacy and Advancement at Fair Test. Akil, what do you think, and we kind of had this conversation separate from this webinar a little bit ago, but what do you think has been the biggest impact, positive or negative, about the proliferance of standardized testing?
That's an interesting question. Thanks for hosting this conversation. I'm coming from New York today. I'm blackity black, American black. I am third generation, maybe fourth generation college. I know my daddy. I think all those things are important to add to the conversation and to point out the assumptions that often exist. To your question of standardized testing. I mean, I think that what I see as interesting is what I have been saying publicly and many others have been saying publicly has now been picked up in a broader conversation. The volume of information added by standardized testing is is nowhere near the cost, I believe, of standardized testing. Your example of Ohio, right? It's absolutely insane. New York City might pay, I've been able to track $6 or $7 million that they pay for admissions testing to 8 schools. And I'm sure there's more because I couldn't track the rest. And I know I haven't tracked the vast majority of it. So we're paying $20 million to deliver one test to get into 8 schools in New York City. Like, that's insane, right? So I think that the biggest thing I hope to see continue is the increased questioning on, is there value that we're getting out of all the cost of standardized testing? And to challenge the notion of test prep as a solution, right? I think one thing that's important is my full-time job is fighting against standardized test misuse. My part-time job, which pays me far more, is a test prep tutor. And I'd like to see that go away. Because there's no rational world where you create a barrier and then say the solution is to pay somebody to help people around the barrier.
Next up, we have Eric Waldo. As Executive Director of Michelle Obama's Reach Higher initiative, Eric is working to inspire every student in the U.S. to take charge of their future by completing their post-secondary education, whether a professional training program, a community college, or a 2-year or 4-year college or university. His role cuts across policy, advocacy, and community engagement to further the goal that the U.S. once again leads the world in terms of college graduates. Waldo currently works at the mission-driven nonprofit Common App, where he continues to lead Mrs. Obama's College Access and Completion Initiative. Eric, I am really curious about the Common App and how that project is addressing disequity in college access.
Definitely want to be talking about race, racism, and inequity as we're confronting this, national moment on race and justice and racism. I myself, I like to introduce myself as a Jewish Puerto Rican from Alabama who grew up in Cleveland. So, a little bit from everywhere. My dad is a Jewish guy from the Bronx. My mom is a woman from Caguas, Puerto Rico, born and raised. And so I grew up in a biracial family, first in the South and then in the Midwest in Cleveland. So I was always sort of the only person in prominently white institutions, the only person who spoke Spanish. The only Latino teachers I had or adults that I experienced in my K-12 experience were the Cuban Spanish teacher and the bus driver. So I'm always really hyper cognizant. Common App is a 45-year-old nonprofit that most people don't realize is a nonprofit and has been around for 45 years in the access, equity, and integrity space. I think Common App has a humongous role to play where 1 million students a year are using the Common App, a third of whom are first generation and low-income students. Common App has over 900 members, and I think we sit at this crossroads of higher education, and right now we're helping students access and get through the higher ed system, but we have a huge role to play around how we make it more equitable. So to me, that means helping students find more money to pay for college.
Finally, we have Davin Sweeney with us. Davin serves as the admissions expert on our STEM Push Network team. He worked for 10 years as a college admissions counselor at the University of Rochester and is currently dean and college counselor for grades 10 through 12 at Avenues in New York City. He's the host of a college and college admissions related podcast called The Crush.
So I identify as wildling, I guess, while we're talking about our racial identification. Irish American, etc. I like to tell people that we left when the food went bad, so I do not know anybody over there. But there are a million different pieces of advice to give students in the college admissions process, and a lot of that advice is not equally available or equally distributed in the interest of talking about equity. I just worked right now to administer an extended time ACT exam to a student that had testing accommodations. There are students everywhere that have absolutely no way to take an exam if they want to take one. And this student attends the school where I work, which is a place of extreme privilege that certainly had all of that roadway sort of laid out to create the conditions for the student to be able to take this exam over multiple days.
What changes can we really expect to see in the post-secondary space, particularly in admissions, in a post-pandemic world? So I know things are kind of in flux right now, but when they settle down, what's it reasonable to expect that we might see as lasting impact and changes?
That's a great question. I'm going to share with you things I hope to see change and things that I fear we will see change,
Yeah.
if that's okay. But I hope to see change. I hope that we get rid of demonstrated interest as a metric. That idea that colleges track student communication, how you open emails, do you engage on social media, do you go to the visits, do you do all those things as a way for colleges to gauge your likelihood of yielding and attending, and that things like that are not a part of what students think of as the process, they disappear. So I really hope that demonstrated interest goes away, because right now for colleges it's really hard to figure that out without recruitment travel and things like that. I hope that goes. I think that could be an enormously positive change. I believe that we're going to see a streamlining of the process this year, that we're going to see more colleges say, and to their benefit, hey, we really don't need 2 recommendations, we only need 1. Oh, maybe we can read this file without a recommendation, right? I think that streamlining will be a really positive thing for us, that as colleges say, we were able to make positive decisions, we were able to make good, well-informed decisions without X, Y, and Z. I think those are potentially positive changes that last with us.
It's really important as we interrogate this problem in question to, again, just be honest about addressing the systemic inequity that already exists. But how do we radically reimagine this? How do we do work in a way that does that well? And I think it's really interesting. I've spent some of my career in more the K-12 side. I've spent probably the last decade or so more in the college access and higher ed space. But higher ed is both really august and successful in this country, but also really immune to change and unregulated from a federal government policy perspective.
When you start to measure which things are valued and which things aren't, it almost somehow miraculously, coincidentally, not intentional at all, lines up with wealth and race.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have to interrogate that. I think as STEM programs, you have to interrogate, is calculus the push, or is there some other thing that we really are trying to get at there, and calculus the proxy? Is AP the requirement, or is AP the proxy for something else? And I think those are the issues that tend to come up in college admissions often that people overlook. They call the SAT a test of college readiness, which I call BS on, right? Most of the 11th graders I work with on SAT prep can do more advanced math than I can. I can't do calculus. I will only tutor the GMAT, the GRE, the LSAT, the SAT, the ACT, the SSAT, all the other tests that don't require real knowledge. I won't do anything that you actually have to know real stuff. But these tests are held out as some sort of college readiness metric. That's problematic.
Yeah, I remember reading at one point, and I don't know if this is accurate or not, that the SAT has a somewhat weak correlation to success in the first semester of freshman year and absolutely no correlation to success beyond that, which I always found really interesting. Marie, what do you think?
Sometimes on the financial piece as well, it's not just about, okay, can I afford to pay full tuition for Harvard or Brown or what have you? The test prep gap too, right? So students who are at Sidwell Friends, not too far away from where I live in Washington, D.C., they can afford the $40,000 test prep person to get them 200 extra points on the SAT, right? And whereas for the low-income students, oh, here's a free Khan Academy class, which we're happy that oh, we gave you this thing, and we think that that's equivalent, right? And again, in sort of the fallacy of this being a meritocracy, we are starting a lot of people not even at third base, they're halfway to home plate. And some people are not even in the stadium. And these are just very, very different conversations. The second thing, as we interrogate these conversations, and I appreciate how Akil is thinking about it, I also like to say in these combos, now I am a big believer, I want people to go to community college. I want folks to go to high quality industry recognized trade and credentialing programs. I want people to go to 4-year. But, again, conversation about race, when you hear people say, I don't know, college isn't worth it, or, not everyone's college material, I want to deconstruct the racism within those concepts, because often what they mean is it's not that their kid, no, their kid's going to college, or, their nephew's going to college, but those other kids, they should go to community college. And the other kids they mean are Black and brown kids and are poor kids. And so again, if we're raising community college or changing the factors, maybe you're at Miami-Dade Community College, you got a great program. it's not that I love community college. I love trade programs that are credentialed and work well. But when we're having these conversations about is college worth it, it's not for everybody, those are also encoded words that have deep, deep history in what we're doing racially and inequitably. And again, you know, we're talking about what we value, whether it's basketball versus track, whether it's calculus versus something else. I would also say legacy admissions, which is a really scary thing for people to talk about. Getting that higher ed credential is a transformative, right? It pushes you into the middle class. It leads to better health outcomes, better life outcomes. It's better for the country. It's better for citizenship. It literally, you know, to take it back to the horse man thing, it is a cure for poverty of a kind.
As operators of STEM programs, you have the ability to shift the conversation beyond standardized testing. You have the ability to say, I know these students, here's the work they have done, and here's how that work differs from the tools we've been used for measuring them, right? If you have a student who's building rockets and bots or whatever, going to competitions, whatever your program does, and they get a 300 on the SAT, like, why should a college care? If it's an engineering program and this child isn't able to answer, you know, whatever SAT question it is, like, I don't know how that's relevant to their ability to perform in engineering. And I think what's overlooked, and the assumption I saw baked into a couple of the questions, is that standardized tests are measures of ability in some way, as opposed to a standardized test is a performance measure on a narrow set of skills. So we could essentially replace the SAT with a test of African history, and we'll see how you do. We'll see who does well on that test, right? It's essentially the same thing. It's using lacrosse to measure athleticism, right? There's a problem with that. Now, there's a certain group of folks who'd love that to be the case because they do really well. And if the majority plays lacrosse, they'd go, of course lacrosse measures athleticism. But it ignores that there's a clear group who are going to be disadvantaged by that. The golfers will be fine, the basketball players not so much, right? So I think that we need to recognize that there is a problem with this type of testing. It doesn't mean it's useless. It means it's limited. So to me, one of the things that would make these things better if they only gave a 5-point scale, because then you can stop pretending that there is a difference between these small differences that are actually meaningful. Sure, if you get no questions right on the SAT, that means a whole lot of something. That means you didn't learn a lot of things in the English language and in math class. But the difference between a 600 math and a 700 math is pretty much irrelevant. So I think part of what we have to do, and you can do as educators and adults in the room, is to interrogate the assumptions with which even the questions are asked around these tools, right? That's why I like grades best, right? Because if we're going to say, how would you perform in college? Let's find the thing that looks most like college. It's certainly not a 3-hour standardized test, right? So I think that's part of the whole assumption that underlies so much of what's going on here.
I think the biggest thing that I've learned with Founding Accept and the work that we've done is that working within your sphere of influence, it makes such major change, you know, and you have this strong network. When I think of STEM, as someone who did not study STEM areas at all, I think of research, I think of data, I think of intellectual rigor, I think of curiosity, I think of poking holes in assumptions, right? That is what the STEM world is. And so how do you all tackle the racism that is baked into college admissions? I think it goes to what Akil said. You use research and data and curiosity to dispel all of those myths that are so rife about this process, about how our students do, about how people of color do in these spaces. And so I think that really is the opportunity, one of the opportunities that y'all have as a network. You know how to use the tools better than anyone. Use them. Teach the rest of us how to use them.
You know, if you're going in the public school system, has the lottery. Now, is every single DC school or DC charter the same quality? No, but they're trying to be transparent about what's great, what's not. Those are places with teachers that will help those students learn. And we as parents or adults or caretakers say, gosh, I really want my student, my child, to go to the place that is the best at getting people to learn and teaching them how to learn and be thoughtful learners. And again, science, growth mindset, lifelong learning. We're not going to be done. We're not credentialing. I would argue there are plenty of people who actually think that we should do higher ed in the same way, that the only equitable way to do higher ed is to say we should do a lottery. There's no shortage of people who would succeed at Harvard, at Ohio State, at Case Western, et cetera. Why have we created this system, which again, I think Marie and Akil and I have all talked about in many ways, the admissions people aren't necessarily saying it is not a meritocracy. They have plenty more people who they know could succeed. The floor to succeed in college, again, I would argue, many students can achieve that. So then how are we thinking about distributing that opportunity? So again, to me, we already do actually have the data that, GPA is actually a much stronger predictor of college success than SAT, ACT. Also, again, there's a great researcher named Angela Duckworth who works at the University of Pennsylvania. She talks about grit, persistence, and tenacity. That's what her research is. Again, she's talking about how do we measure that sort of stick-to-itiveness, which is actually more important than whether you're a great standardized test taker for your happiness and success in life for confronting challenges and bouncing back. So that resilience. So to me, I think we actually probably need to start over and use some great, again, design-centered, Stanford Design School, IDEO type organizations that know how to do human-centered design with an equity lens to create a totally different system. This should be disrupted the same way Netflix disrupted Blockbuster, the same way Spotify and Apple disrupted music. One of us, you can do it. Please take me up on it. You can be the disruptor for how we totally radically reimagine how we let people achieve their potential in higher ed.